Today's going to seem long because it's 3 chapters, but they are fairly short chapters, about the same amount of pages. So, with that being said, let's read chapters 13, 14, and 15. If you last remember, Ben was trying to convince Mrs. Tibbets to figure out a way to save the land, contact the state, or talk to those people that were out there surveying, or talk to Tabitha again, but she kind of basically said no. So, chapter 13. Mr. Nickleby would like to see you in his office, Mrs. Kutcher says to Ben. He wants to see me? Ben asks. What for? I don't know, she says. The secretary just sent me a note asking for you to come to the principal's office. The last bell will ring in a few minutes, so you'd better get your things and hurry down there. Ben walks down the empty hallway, wondering why Mr. Nickleby sent for him. He's never been called to the office for doing anything wrong before. He doesn't like Mr. Nickleby, but not just because he's the principal. Ben can't put his finger on why, but he just doesn't trust him. Could I be in trouble because of my schoolwork? He wonders. He hasn't done his geography report, but Mr. Nickleby couldn't have heard about that. For all Mrs. Kutcher knows, he's been working on the report all along. When he reaches the office, he sees his mom and dad just outside it, sitting in the chairs against the wall. What are they doing here? He gets a sick feeling in his stomach. Before Ben can say anything to his parents, Mr. Nickleby strides out of his office toward them, wearing one of those fake little smiles that adults give kids when they want something out of them. Hello, Ben, Mr. Nickleby says. Why don't you all come on in? Ben looks at his parents for some sign, but their faces don't reveal anything. Come on, champ, his father says, smiling, but even his dad's smile isn't very comforting. Something is really wrong. Mr. Nickleby gestures for them to come into his office. As Ben goes by, his mother reaches out and touches his shoulder. Mr. Nickleby drags a couple of extra chairs so there's a place for each of them to sit. Then he positions himself behind his desk. It's like it's a fort or something. Ben's mom pulls her chair close to Ben's. What's wrong? Ben wonders. Did something happen to Agatha? Is one of my grandparents sick? Mr. Nickleby leans back a little and folds his hands. Ben, I asked your parents to come in so we could all talk about a couple of things. All of us here together, all right? Sure. Ben's voice isn't much more than a squeak. How are you getting along with the kids in your class? Are you getting used to being here? Sure, Ben says. Yeah. Anybody in particular you're having a hard time with? No, not really. He could do without Frankie Murley and his buddies, and Ryan sometimes drives him crazy, but Ben's not about to say anything that would get anybody in trouble. Mr. Nickleby pauses for a moment, scratching the side of his neck. Ben looks at his parents. They're trying to hide it, but they can't. He can tell they're upset. Finally, his dad speaks. We've been talking with Mr. Nickleby while we were waiting for you. He'd like to ask you a few questions about Mrs. Tibbets. Okay, says Ben. This doesn't help much. He still can't figure out what's going on. How do you like Mrs. Tibbets? Mr. Nickleby asks. Fine. I like her fine. I've heard you've helped her around her house a little. Uh-huh, Ben says. Yes, sir. What do you do when you go there? Now Ben is confused. He's sure there's a right answer and a wrong answer, but he can't think of what they might be or where this conversation is headed. It feels like a trap. I helped her in the backyard, and one night she showed me some toads in a little pool. All three adults stare at Ben. Mr. Nickleby breaks the uncomfortable silence with another question. Anything else? No, Ben says, shaking his head. Mr. Nickleby draws in a breath. What about snakes? Did you help her with snakes? No. Did Mrs. Tibbets tell Mr. Nickleby about how he let the snakes out? Is he in trouble for that? Does Mrs. Tibbets have some poisonous snakes? Rattlesnakes, for instance? Ben glances over at his parents. His dad's sitting there looking like he's trying his best to keep his mouth shut. His mom just looks worried. Couldn't you ask her? Ben doesn't want to say more until he figures out what's going on. I'll talk to Mrs. Tibbets, but first we'd like to hear your story. Ben, his dad's eyes look tired. Just tell Mr. Nickleby what you know. Well, she did, but they got away. Did she let you help with the snakes? Mr. Nickleby asks. No, not really. What do you mean, not really? Did she let you get near them? No, she... Well, Ben, Mr. Nickleby interrupts. Here's the problem. That's not what you told some other kids. I know, but that was just a story I made up. But we understand that Ryan Brisson said it was true. Suddenly, Ben's dad sits forward. Wait a minute, Mr. Nickleby, we've talked about this already. The snakes got away. Mrs. Tibbets called us and told us. Ben doesn't know anything about it. Ben glances over at his dad. His parents trust him, but they don't know what really happened. I want Ben's side of the story, Mr. Nickleby said. Ryan didn't know anything about it. He was just saying that so the other kids would believe me. He's never even been to her house. Mr. Nickleby leans forward. So you didn't have anything to do with the snakes? Ben looks at his parents. He bows his head. What is it, Ben? His mother asks. What happened, Ben? His father asks. Now they're both concerned. I let them out, Ben whispers. What did you say? Mr. Nickleby asks. I didn't hear you. I let them out, Ben says louder. I didn't mean to, but I did. Ben, his mother says, you told us you didn't. I know. I'm sorry. Did Mrs. Tibbets know you opened the cage? Mr. Nickleby asks. No, I didn't tell her. She told me not to touch the cage, but I did, and they got out. Ben, why didn't you tell us? His mom asks. I couldn't. I wanted to, but I couldn't. And then finally, I told Mrs. Tibbets the night of the Spadefoots. She wasn't. Mrs. Tibbets should have told you, Mr. Nickleby said to Ben's parents, and she shouldn't have left Ben alone with the snakes. Suddenly, Ben understands. Mr. Nickleby isn't mad at him. He's mad at Mrs. Tibbets. She told me not to, Ben tries to keep his voice under control. I wasn't supposed to go near them. It wasn't her fault. She told me not to go near the snakes, and I did anyway. All right, says Mr. Nickleby, shifting in his chair. I think I've got a pretty good picture of what happened. No, you don't, Ben protests. Okay, Ben's dad says. He put his hand on the back of Ben's neck and gives him a gentle squeeze. It's all right, Ben, says Mr. Nickleby. We don't need to talk about this anymore right now. He relaxes back into his chair. What about your classes? Are there any problems there? Ben shakes his head. I hear the 5th graders are doing a big report on ecosystems. How's yours coming? Okay. Ben can't get his mind off the snakes. Why didn't he just leave the cage alone? And why did he have to tell stupid Frankie Murley about them? Everybody stands up. Mr. Nickleby extends his hand for Ben to shake. Ben doesn't want to, but he forces himself to put out his hand. The principal's palm is moist with sweat. Will Mrs. Tibbets be okay? Ben asks. We'll see how things work out, Mr. Nickleby says. It really wasn't her fault. I know that's what you think, Ben. Mr. Nickleby guides him toward the door. Why don't you step outside and let me talk with your parents for just a minute? Ben waits just outside the office, listening. He can hear Mr. Nickleby's voice, but he can't make out the words. Just as school lets out, Ben grabs his backpack and dashes down the hallway, dodging between the kids pouring out of the classrooms. He runs all the way to Mrs. Tibbets' room. She's not there. Chapter 14. Ben slumps down in the back seat of the car. Agatha sits beside him, chattering a blue steak. For once, he's grateful for her mouth. He looks out the window. The leaves on the trees are opening, and the lawns and fields are turning a soft yellow-green. He opens the window a crack. The air is warmer than it was yesterday. He thinks about the vernal pool and wonders if it has shrunk even more. When they get home, his father stands by the front door as Ben's mom and sister walk in. Ben tries to slip by him, but his father catches his arm. Ben? Ben stops and looks up at his father. Ben, you've never lied to us before. His father isn't yelling. He'd rather have him yell. I didn't lie, Ben says. I just didn't tell you. Same difference, his father says. You should have told us. You hurt me and your mom. I know, Ben says. It was too hard. Well, look where we are now. It's much worse than if you had told us. Ben nods. It's true. And Mrs. Tibbets made a mistake, too. Dad, don't blame her. Mr. Nickleby doesn't like her. I can see that. She may be a good person and a great teacher, but still. She is, Ben says. They both stand there in the doorway. Finally, his dad shakes his head and says, Well, we'll all learn something from this. Why don't you go do your homework now? I have to get back to work. I'll see you at dinner. Back in his room, Ben sits at his desk and stares at the wall. Pretty soon his mind is back on Mrs. Tibbets' land and the Spadefoots. He's made everything worse somehow. The Overtoad would know what to do. For starters, he could swallow Mr. Nickleby and Mrs. Tibbets' sister-in-law and the men with the bulldozers. Ben rummages through his backpack looking for the sheet about the ecosystems report. Only 1 week left. If he starts on it now, there'll still be time. Amphibians of the World is sitting on his desk. Ben drops his backpack and leafs through the book, skipping over the Amazon rainforest in Central America until he comes to North America. He flips past the pictures of the tree frogs and leopard frogs and the enormous Rocky Mountain toad. When he comes to the picture of the Colorado River toad, he remembers the one that sat in their laundry room in Tucson. Boy, that was a long time ago, he thinks. Then he turns the page, and there it is, the eastern spadefoot. It's not fancy like the leopard frog or big like the Rocky Mountain toad. Nobody will miss it when it's gone. He thinks about Mrs. Tibbets. Could she lose her job all because of a couple of rattlesnakes? If she does, will it be his fault? He thinks about Ryan. His friend stuck with him at lunch. In spite of Ben's stupid comment about the crossed eyes, Ben smiles, thinking about Ryan's attempt to stand up for him. Poor goofy Ryan. Even when he's trying to help, things go wrong. The phone rings, and he slams the book shut. Another ring. Mom and Agatha must be outside, he thinks. He picks up on the fourth ring. Hello? A man's voice at the other end of the line says, I'm calling for Ben Maroney. That's me, Ben answers. I'm Ben. Oh, the man says, sounding a little confused. Is your dad's name Ben too? No, just me. Well, Ben, this is Hank Lindsay from the Natural Heritage Program at the State Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. I got an email from you about some spadefoot toads. For a second, Ben is speechless. He can't believe it. But when he starts speaking, he can't stop. Yes, sir. Thanks for calling back, Mr. Lindsay. Thank you so much. Really, my teacher, Mrs. Tibbets, has spadefoots in her vernal pool, and her sister-in-law wants to sell the land, and I was wondering if you could save it. Whoa, the man says. Hold on. Whose land is it? Ben struggles for the best way to tell the story. Well, part of it belongs to my teacher, the part where her house is, but the rest of it belongs to her sister-in-law, and now that my teacher's husband died, her sister-in-law wants to sell the property so they can build houses there. But the spadefoot toads have already hatched out in the vernal pool, and I think maybe there's some salamanders too. Spadefoots are endangered, aren't they? I tried to figure out how to stop them from bulldozing the pond, but I didn't know what to do. So I thought if you could just come and see. It's all Ben can think of to say. It's quiet on the other end of the line for a few seconds. Then the man says, well, I don't know. Please, Ben begs, just come and look at it. It's really beautiful. We found 15 pairs of spadefoots. No, 16. You're sure they're spadefoots? They're smoother than other toads, and they've got these little pads on their hind feet and yellow stripes on their back. Oh, and their pupils are vertical and... Okay, the man chuckles. I believe you. And how did you find them? Mrs. Tibbets took me to the pond. You went out looking for them? Uh-huh. A couple of weeks ago when it rained really hard one night. I know the night. I was out too. You were? I sure was. Ben, if you don't mind me asking, how old are you? 10? Almost 11? And this is your teacher's land? Right. It's Mrs. Tibbets and her sister-in-law's. Wait a minute. Is this Mrs. Tibbets, the wife of Tom Tibbets, the high school teacher? Yes, sir. Her husband's name was Thomas, but he died a year ago. Oh, I hadn't heard. I knew him. He was a good scientist. So is Mrs. Tibbets. Ben notices his mother has come into the room. He gives her a pleading look so she doesn't interrupt. Can you come? Ben asks. Well, son, I don't know how much I can do. It sounds pretty complicated. I know, sir, but you've got to help us. They're going to start building soon, and this is our last chance. I know you want to save the spadefoots, but it's the ownership of the land that's the problem. And if the pool is very small and dries up before we get a chance to document it, it will be difficult to certify it as an endangered habitat. Listen, why don't you give me Mrs. Tibbets' phone number and I'll give her a call? But can you come? Soon, I mean? Ben hears the man leafing through some papers. I'm in Boston at meetings most of the week, and I have to be in the field all day Thursday. I could try to come Friday. Can't you come sooner? I'm sorry, Friday will have to do. Don't get your hopes up too much, Ben. There's got to be definite documentation to hold up something like a building project. Okay, Ben says, but please come. Ben, did Mrs. Tibbets teach you about those spadefoots? Yes, sir. She must be a good teacher. She is. Ben finds Mrs. Tibbets' number where his mom had written it on the cover of their telephone book and reads it out. He says goodbye and hangs up. Excuse me. His mother is still standing there, staring at him. Ben, honey, what on earth is going on? That was a man named Mr. Lindsay. He's from the Natural Heritage Program. Natural Heritage? What did he want? He's going to help us save Mrs. Tibbet's land. I don't know what you're talking about, honey. Ben starts to explain. Mrs. Tibbet's sister-in-law owns the land with the pool on it. She wants to sell it, and I thought... His mother interrupts. Ben, you're only in 5th grade. This has got to stop. You've already caused enough trouble with Mrs. Tibbet's and her snakes. You need to do homework and play with friends and let grown-ups worry about problems like this. You can't interfere on other people's business. But if the man comes and looks at the land... No, listen to me. That's enough, Ben. Mrs. Tibbetts is a grown-up. This is her problem. You have to stay out of it. Ben knows there's no use arguing. Okay, Mom, okay. His mother looks at him. That doesn't sound very convincing. I'm thinking your dad and I will have to talk with Mrs. Tibbetts. Maybe her sister-in-law is right. Maybe she should sell the land. I can't imagine what she was thinking, keeping those snakes. Please don't call her, Mom. His mother shakes her head and goes into the kitchen. We'll need to talk this over more when your father gets home, she calls. Ben can't wait. He has to see Mrs. Tibbetts. He has to see her now. He slips on his boots and jacket. As he's going out the back door, he yells, I'm going to take a little walk. I'll be back soon. Ben, his mother yells, wait. But he's out the door and across the backyard, heading quickly toward Mrs. Tibbetts on the path through the marsh, a path he knows by heart. Chapter 15. Mrs. Tibbetts' car isn't in the driveway. Ben knocks on the door. No answer. He goes around the house and peers through the kitchen window. She isn't home. He runs back around the garage, then takes the trail back to the vernal pool. It's barely 10 feet across now, not much more than a big puddle. He hunkers down to look for the tadpoles, but he can't see any. He pushes the muddy leaves around with a stick, hoping to stir them up. Are they gone already? How can he save the land if there aren't any endangered animals here? He's pretty sure he convinced Mr. Lindsay there had been spadefoots in the pool, but he doubts that will be enough. He doubles back through the woods and checks the house again. Now Mrs. Tibbetts is in the backyard filling some bird feeders. Hi, Mrs. Tibbetts, Ben calls, hoping his nervousness doesn't show in his voice. Oh, hi, Ben. Can you help me? This bag is so big I can barely lift it. Ben goes over and takes one corner of the bag, and together they fill the rest of the feeders. I tried to find you after school, Ben says. Oh, sorry I missed you. I had a meeting. Ben's mouth goes dry, but he makes himself say it. I told Mr. Nickleby and my parents you didn't let me near the rattlesnakes. I told them everything was my fault. No, it was all my fault. I should have never kept the snakes. I should have had someone take them away as soon as Thomas died, but I knew he was so fond of them. She laughs. Fond of rattlesnakes. There aren't many people that you can say that of. Still, you told me to stay away from the cage. If I had done what you said, they never would have gotten loose. Ben helps Mrs. Tibbetts carry the bag to the garage. Are you going to lose your job? He asks. Ben, I'm going to tell you something. I used to look forward to going to school each day, but I don't think I should teach anymore. There's too much red tape for me now, too many forms to fill out, and too many meetings. I like being with children. I like science. I like teaching, but I don't like school anymore. I wouldn't want to teach either if I had to work for Mr. Nickleby, Ben says. Mrs. Tibbetts doesn't respond, but he can see the hint of a smile in her eyes. I talked to a man from the state, he says, about the spadefoots, and he said he would call you. I know, Mrs. Tibbetts said. You know? He just called as I got home. Is he coming? Yes, he's coming, but I don't think it will do us any good, Ben. When I explained the situation, he said it didn't look good, just as I had thought. But maybe, Ben says. Maybe, Mrs. Tibbetts repeats. Maybe, but I think he's only coming as a favor because he knew my husband. Unfortunately, I think my sister-in-law and the real estate agent will be here too. Why do they have to come? It's Tabitha's land, Ben, not mine. Well, if she owns the land, then she owns the Spadefoots, and if she owns the Spadefoots, she should take care of them. They were here first. Mrs. Tibbetts looks up in the sky. I wonder, she says, what toads would do if they owned the land and we lived on it. Ben pictures the overtoad looking down on them, deciding what would happen to people. I think we'd be in big trouble, he says. I think you're right, says Mrs. Tibbetts. They're quiet for a minute. Then she asks, do your parents know you're here? No, not really. Maybe you should go home now. We're all in enough hot water. They must think I'm a weird old woman. No, they don't. Well, that's what I am, an odd old duck in hiking boots. Now, shoo. Ben gives her a little nod and heads for home. Why won't she do anything to try to save her land? He wonders. He wants to be mad at her, but he can't. He picks up his pace. He doesn't want to be late for dinner. Mrs. Tibbets is right about one thing. He's already in enough trouble. Maybe his parents should just wrap him up and stick him in a box and ship him back to Tucson.